History records the king's death on a single date. One moment, one announcement, one funeral. But that is only the official version, because weeks before church bells rang and black banners were raised, something far more disturbing had already happened behind palace walls. The king had already died once. Late one winter night, guards were ordered to clear the inner corridor outside the royal chamber. Physicians were summoned in silence. No scribes, no witnesses, no prayers allowed. According to a private medical note discovered centuries later, the king was found unresponsive, pulse faint, breath irregular, pupils fixed, for nearly 30 minutes. No signs of life could be confirmed. In any other circumstance, death would have been declared. But kings do not die like ordinary men. They die when the crown allows it. The physicians attempted revival using methods never meant for public knowledge, extreme measures, reserved for heirs, not aging rulers. When the king finally gasped, the room reportedly fell silent, not with relief, but fear, because what returned was not the same man. Servants noticed first. The king no longer recognized familiar faces. He spoke less, but when he did, his words were precise gold. He asked questions he should not have known to ask, details of conversations he was never present for, decisions discussed only in secret councils. He slept little, and when he slept, guards reported hearing him speak to someone else in the room, someone unseen. The court physician recorded a line he never intended to survive history. The body lives, the authority remains, but something has shifted. The court did not announce the incident. Instead, they locked the palace. Public appearances were canceled. Official decrees were delayed. When the king finally appeared on a balcony weeks later, the crowd cheered, but many noticed how still he stood, how little he moved, how his eyes scanned faces not with warmth, but calculation. Privately, the council debated succession for the first time while the king was still alive, because they feared a truth worse than death, that whatever had returned was wearing the king, not ruling as him. Then came the second death. This time, it was public, ceremonial, proper. The king collapsed during a formal gathering, surrounded by witnesses. Physicians declared him dead within minutes. Bells rang, messengers rode, the empire mourned, but the council ordered something unprecedented. The body was sealed immediately, no public viewing, no extended rites, and buried before sunrise, because those who had seen the king between the two deaths knew something history was never meant to record. The king had not died twice, he had returned once. And the truth of why terrified the crown more than rebellion ever could. The period between the king's first death and his second lasted only 23 days. Yet within the palace, those days stretched unnaturally long. Time behaved differently around him. Court schedules unraveled. Meetings that should have taken minutes extended into hours, while entire afternoons vanished without record. Servants swore clocks slowed near the king's chambers, then rushed to catch up once they left. The king resumed ruling almost immediately, too immediately. He summoned advisors before news of his illness had even reached the public. Policies were revised with ruthless efficiency. Old alliances were questioned, ancient privileges revoked. He did not consult. He calculated. One minister wrote in his private diary, "He governs like a man who knows this is his last chance, or like someone who knows he does not have much time here." The king demanded records, old ones, burial customs, succession laws, coronation rites from forgotten centuries. He asked what happened. 2 kings who died without heirs, and whether the crown ever passed before death. When told such things were taboo, he smiled, a thin, unfamiliar expression. More disturbing were the private audiences. Nobles summoned to speak with him often left shaken. Some described the sensation of being examined rather than heard. Others claimed the king repeated their own thoughts back to them before they spoke. One count fainted after the king leaned close and whispered, "You should not have survived that winter." Guards noticed that the king no longer ate publicly. Food was brought in and removed untouched. Wine was poured and left to evaporate, yet he did not weaken. He seemed sustained. At night, palace staff heard pacing from the royal chamber. Sometimes a second set of footsteps matched his stride. Sometimes arguments, one voice pleading, the other commanding. Always the same voice, the king's. Twice, physicians were summoned again near the end of the period. This time, the king was conscious, lucid, and furious at their presence. He dismissed them with a phrase that spread through the palace like poison. "You already failed me once." By the final week, the council had begun planning openly for after, not because the king appeared ill, but because they feared what he was becoming. On the 23rd day, the king requested a full court gathering. He wore ceremonial robes, spoke clearly, issued a final decree that would reshape succession law forever. Then he collapsed. This time, no effort was made to revive him. No one reached for instruments. No one called for intervention. The room remained still until life left him, because some deaths are not meant to be interrupted twice. After the second death, the palace fell into an uneasy silence. Courtiers whispered that the king's body did not look entirely human. His features seemed sharpened to still, and his skin unusually pale. Physicians who attended both deaths documented anomalies they dared not speak aloud. Temperature fluctuations inconsistent with life, faint traces of movement beneath the shroud, and irregular heart rhythms recorded only in secret notes. The first death, they realized, had left something behind, something that wore the king as a shell. Some servants claimed to hear faint breathing after the formal death. Others swore that the king's eyes, when viewed in certain mirrors, seemed to follow them still, even in the coffin. But the court did not investigate. They could not. The crown was at stake, and admitting the truth could topple centuries of power. And yet the rumors spread quietly, carefully like shadows sliding along stone walls. Nobles began altering their behavior. Courtiers avoided private corridors. Advisors left notes under doors rather than speaking aloud. Every whisper was measured, every glance suspicious. One chamberlain recorded in a hidden diary, "We do not speak of him. We do not speak of the first death. But at night, when the halls are empty, I feel him pacing. Not the king, something else wearing him." The fear was more psychological than physical. There were no attacks, no curses, no overt harm. But the presence was undeniable. It commanded attention. It demanded caution. It influenced decisions. Without intervention, historians later noted abrupt changes in the empire during the weeks following the king's second death. Policies became stricter. Succession laws were rewritten. Spies were deployed more heavily. Diplomats were delayed in their travel. Some argued these were coincidences. Insiders, however, knew otherwise. Every choice seemed guided by an unseen hand. The most unsettling theory circulated quietly among palace scribes. The king had died, returned, and in those weeks, something had learned to imitate him, not perfectly, not entirely, but convincingly enough to preserve his authority while subtly shifting power behind the scenes. By the end of the year, no one dared contradict the new decrees. The council's private letters reflect a chilling awareness. We rule under the gaze of what should not be named. Questioning invites observation. Observation ensures compliance. The second death became the official story. The first, the inexplicable. And the truth, the terrifying truth, was left to private whispers, lost diaries, and those few who survived long enough to witness it. The king had died twice, and yet, in some sense, he never truly left. After the king's second death, the royal council convened in secret chambers no scribe had entered for decades. Their purpose was not mourning but survival. They had witnessed something impossible. A king who died, returned, and then truly passed, leaving behind questions they could not answer. The council feared the crown itself had absorbed knowledge. Not the king's knowledge, something else entirely. Something older, something patient. Every decree the council made was scrutinized, carefully phrased, as though the walls themselves were listening. Messages were written in code. Orders were confirmed twice, thrice, sometimes in private hand signals. Any hint of uncertainty risked exposure. One minister recorded, "The throne is no longer merely a seat. It is an entity. It watches. It waits." Even ambassadors were treated with suspicion. Diplomats who had previously been welcomed into the palace were now interrogated about their knowledge of the king's illness before the public announcement of death. The council feared spies not foreign, but internal. Those who had witnessed the first death could inadvertently reveal truths that no one was meant to know. The fear extended to succession. Heirs were examined, tested, and observed constantly, not for ambition, but for integrity. A wrong word, a misstep in etiquette, or hesitation in speech could be interpreted as alignment with forces unknown. Rituals changed. Public ceremonies were shortened. Funerals became private. The crown, once a symbol of continuity, now represented control over knowledge itself. The council avoided discussing the first death entirely. It was unofficial. An error in the records, or a clerical mistake, if anyone asked. In truth, no one dared acknowledge what had occurred. To speak of it was to invite the attention of whatever had returned with the king. Even after decades, their notes reveal unease. One archivist wrote, "Decades may pass. The king sleeps, yet the palace knows, and we, who manage the palace, know too much. To forget is impossible. To speak is fatal." Outside the palace walls, life continued normally. Citizens celebrated festivals, collected taxes, and farmed the lands. Yet within the inner chambers, time had warped. Decisions were guided not only by law or logic, but by fear of what lingered unseen. Some whispers among the council suggested the king's return had been a warning. Others argued it was a test, designed to see which officials could maintain composure under impossible circumstances. The truth may never be known. What is certain, the council who survived understood one thing. The crown was more than power. It was a secret that could not be questioned. And those who attempted to do so were quietly removed, exiled, reassigned, or simply never seen again. The monarchy continued. The empire endured. But everyone who had been present during the first death carried a single, unspoken truth. The king had died twice, and the shadow of that second life lingered long after he was gone. The night before the king's second death was unlike any other the palace had ever seen. Silence had settled over the corridors, but it was not the ordinary quiet of night. It was the expectant stillness of something waiting, watching. In the king's chamber, the air was thick, almost tangible, as if every object, every tapestry, had absorbed the memory of the first death. Servants who dared enter claimed the candles burned blue and unevenly, flickering despite the lack of wind. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, merging and separating with a deliberate rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. The king sat upright in his chair, eyes wide open, staring at nothing or perhaps everything. He did not speak. He did not eat. He did not blink as guards paced outside his door. And yet, his presence dominated the room. Something ancient and intelligent had taken residence within him, guiding his body, measuring each breath, and listening to the whispers of those around him. At midnight, the first signs appeared. A soft tapping echoed along the chamber walls, like fingernails tracing invisible lines. Servants froze. The taps became rhythmic, almost deliberate. Then a voice faint, chilling. Unmistakably, the king spoke without moving his lips. "They are watching us." No one in the room had said a word. The council, who had been summoned in secret, understood instantly. The king's first death had left more than just memory behind. It had left awareness, something that could perceive without being seen, judge without being human, and move without leaving a trace. Hours passed. Shadows swirled across the floor, climbing walls, merging with the king himself. A servant fainted. Another bolted, only to vanish without a sound, leaving a chair tipping over as the only evidence he had been there. By dawn, the king's chamber was empty, or nearly. He remained seated, still alive, still breathing, still watching, but the presence within him had grown stronger, harsher, and deliberate. Those who had seen him during the first death claimed he was no longer just a man. He was a vessel, a living crown, and a sentinel of knowledge that no one could challenge. The council realized the terrifying truth. The king could die publicly, ceremonially, even a second time, but the first death had awakened something that would never leave. And that night, everyone in the palace understood it. No one would speak. No one would act rashly. No one would dare forget. For the king had died twice, but something had returned the first time, and it would linger forever. The physicians who attended the king during his first death carried a burden no law could relieve. They had witnessed what no medical text could explain: a body that had stopped, yet returned; a mind that had changed; a presence that was not entirely human. Each doctor was bound by oath and fear. Some fell ill. Some vanished without explanation. One, rumored to have written the most detailed account, was found months later in a distant monastery, refusing to speak and scratching indecipherable symbols into stone walls. The surviving notes, smuggled centuries later, suggest that the king's first death was a ritual threshold, an event where life and something beyond it intersected. The king had crossed it briefly, returned, and brought back knowledge that no one else could bear. He no longer required food, nor sleep in the usual sense. Observers noted that he would sit for hours staring at maps, documents, or people, absorbing and analyzing them with a precision that unnerved even the most experienced council members. The physician's greatest fear, however, was not the king himself, it was the process. They realized that if the first death had succeeded fully, the crown might have been left vulnerable. If it failed entirely, it might return fully, bringing something older, smarter, and unstoppable. This knowledge was deliberately erased from official records. The council instructed the physicians to swear secrecy on pain of exile, imprisonment, or worse. They were to destroy most of their notes and leave behind only innocuous summaries. Some notes survived, hidden inside false books or carved into the walls of abandoned chambers. They speak of a king who learned beyond the living, who heard thoughts not his own, and who could see threads of events before they happened. No one in the palace spoke openly of these occurrences. Not the council, not the guards, not the servants, because the king had returned once, and the shadow of that first death still lingered over everyone. The physicians understood that history would remember only the second death. The first would remain a secret, and any breach of that secret might awaken what had returned with him. Following the king's second death, the empire outwardly appeared stable. Laws were enforced, taxes collected, and ceremonies held. Diplomats attended meetings, soldiers marched. The world saw continuity, But inside the palace, every decision was weighed against a hidden truth. The first death had left a shadow. The council operated with a constant, unspoken caution. Advisors spoke in half-words. Orders were delayed until certainty could be tested. Anyone who had witnessed the king between deaths was watched closely. The empire learned to adapt without questioning. Military campaigns were postponed. Succession disputes were settled quietly. Alliances were maintained, but negotiations stretched months longer than necessary. Leaders understood implicitly mistakes could expose knowledge that must remain buried. Even outside the palace, influence subtly shifted. Courtiers who had been close to the king during the first death gained quiet prestige. Their opinions carried weight not from merit, but from what they knew and had survived. Those unaware of the events were effectively powerless. Letters and documents from this period reveal strange behavior. Royal decrees were framed cautiously, never absolute. Nobles were assigned tasks with precise wording to avoid inadvertent revelation. Internal memos hint at fear without naming its source. Proceed as instructed, but trust nothing outside these walls. The public remained unaware. Festivals continued. Public mourning occurred for the ceremonial death, while the first death remained unspoken. Yet its effects rippled across the empire. Decisions slowed, efficiency diminished, and hesitation became the default mode. Generals hesitated before committing forces. Officials questioned orders. Diplomats double-checked every phrase. The empire became methodical, cautious, and slower, but it survived. The council's hidden rule was simple: never act as if the first death had occurred. Never acknowledge the king's return. Pretend the crown was ordinary. While every member of the inner circle understood that the throne had been touched by the impossible, even decades later, surviving documents hint at a culture shaped more by fear than law. Decisions were guided less by strategy than by instinctive caution, as if the empire itself remembered something the people could not. The king had died twice, and the empire had learned, not through education, not through policy, but through silent terror. The story of the king who died twice is not one of rebellion, conquest, or ordinary history. It is a story of secrets too dangerous to record, and of knowledge too heavy for anyone to bear. The first death, invisible to the public, left behind something that the crown could never fully release. The second death, public and ceremonial, was a cover, a way to reassure the empire while ensuring the truth remained hidden. Those who witnessed the first death carried fear as much as memory. Their lives were forever altered. Some disappeared quietly, some remained, silently guiding the empire according to what they had seen. Their decisions, their hesitations, their insistence on caution shaped the policies and culture of the realm for decades. The crown itself became more than a symbol of authority. It became a container of knowledge, a focal point for the extraordinary, and a warning to those who would come too close. Advisors learned to speak in riddles. Nobles learned that certain doors in the palace were better left unopened. Servants understood that obedience was not enough, silence was required. Historians centuries later would record only one death. The first, they would say, was a rumor, a clerical mistake, an unverified tale. But the truth, the terrifying truth, is that for those 23 days, the king who returned carried something beyond life, something that lingered, something that altered minds, decisions, and the course of the empire. The second death did not end it. The shadow of that return remained, shaping the monarchy quietly, invisibly, perpetually. Policies that seemed prudent were guided by knowledge no living historian could confirm. Alliances that survived political pressure were maintained by instinct, not strategy. Decisions were slower, deliberate, cautious, not out of wisdom alone, but because the palace remembered what could not be. Admit it, in the end, the king died twice, and yet, in a sense, he never truly left. The empire endured because it feared the truth. Citizens never knew. Courtiers understood only fragments, and those who survived the first death, those who truly saw, carried a secret heavy enough to last generations. Every crown, every throne, every palace bears the weight of what history forgets. Some moments are erased not because they were unimportant, but because they were too powerful to be known. The king's first death, the king's return. The shadow left behind these events remind us that history is not always written by what happens, but by what can safely be recorded. If you ever hear whispers about the monarch who died twice, or feel the weight of authority in silence, remember this: some deaths are only beginnings, and some kings never leave, even when the world believes they have.